My microphone? Perfect. So welcome, everybody. On behalf of Nancy Horowitz, the director of the WWII Center, I am very happy to welcome you. I'm Abigail Gilman. I'm a faculty member in Jewish Studies, and I also teach Hebrew, German, and comparative literature here at BU. This lecture is the third of our Elie Wiesel Memorial Lecture Series of 2022-23. Just to refresh your memories, we had Professor Timothy Snyder from Yale, who spoke back in October about Ukraine and the question of genocide. And in November, we heard Professor Irene Kakandis from Dartmouth College speak about co-witnessing and social justice. And these are three linked lectures on a very important theme. And I'd like to just remind students in the room that we now have a major that is organized through the center in Holocaust, genocide, and human rights studies. And of course, we have two minor programs, Jewish studies and also Holocaust, genocide, and human rights studies. And one more announcement, that is our final event for this semester will be the Yitzhak Rabin Memorial Lecture featuring Professor Penina Lahav. And Penina Lahav's lecture topic is The Only Woman in the Room, Writing the Life of Golda Meir. The date is April 25th at 5 p.m. The event will be at Hillel, on the fourth floor of Hillel. Please put it in your calendars. And that is my segue to introduce Professor Lahav, who's going to moderate and introduce our speaker. On a personal note, I'm just so pleased that Leora Bilsky is here tonight and back on our campus. She was a visiting professor a few years ago. I still remember her lecture and an amazing course she taught on the history of trials, important trials in Israel. And so you're really in for a treat. And Penina Lahav, as you know, is a professor of law emerita and an important member, a vital member of the Wiesel Center at BU. And in addition to her expertise in constitutional law and First Amendment law and legal history and her scholarship, she was recently awarded the Israel Studies Award for Lifetime Achievement. And also more recently, the Prime Minister Golda Meir Award for Society and Leadership. Extremely impressive. And you will hear more from Professor Lahav in a couple of weeks. So we won't go into that right now, but Nina, come and.
Thank you very much, Abby. It's an honor and privilege to be here and to present Professor Bilsky, who's been a very long-time friend of mine. And I learned so much from her, and I always enjoy talking to her and spending time with her. A very special person, as you will hear shortly. Leora Bilsky is the Benno Gitter Professor of Human Rights and Holocaust Studies at Tel Aviv University School of Law. And she is also the director of the Minerva Center for Human Rights. She is a graduate of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, the law school, summa cum laude. Very few people I know who graduated summa cum laude from that faculty of law, and also from Yale Law School, graduate of Yale Law School. This year, she is a fellow at the Katz Center for Advanced Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Bilsky is the recipient of the 2010 prestigious Zeltner Prize in Israel, and the author of multiple articles and 2 important books. A third book that she is presently completed addresses the struggle over the cultural genocide in the context of the Eichmann trial. For purposes of clarification, even though I'm not sure I really need to do it, but I will anyway, let me offer you a roadmap for Bilsky's lecture today. As I said, her present work revolves around the concept of cultural genocide and the way that legal systems, including international law, understood and legislated cultural genocide. The Jewish people lost 6 million of its members during World War II. But we know that the Nazi aim was not merely to murder the Jews as persons. It was targeted at wiping or eliminating the contributions or the meaning of the Jewish Life Project. Bilsky will discuss the Sars-Savoie report, a report known as Sars-Savoie. This report was submitted to the French government concerning the colonial looting of African cultural assets. And she will compare the Sars-Savoie report to the German effort to eliminate Jewish cultural assets. So we are going to have here in the intellectual exercise in comparison. Thus, she will highlight the differences and similarities that will help us understand the nature of the crimes involved in each. Note that this effort, once again, puts on display Bilsky's interdisciplinary versatility and her capacity to excavate in the depths of social and legal phenomena, as you'll see shortly, in ways that only a few can master and in ways that we admire so much. Leora, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Pnina, for your generous and kind introduction. And thank you, Nancy, for inviting me here. And of course, thank you, Abby, for the kind words and the introduction. I am excited and very glad to return here on this occasion of the Elie Wiesel lecture. I was here in the year 2016 and 17 and feel connected in a deep way to this place. So I hope you'll enjoy the lecture. So let me begin. In Thesis on the Philosophy of History, Walter Benjamin famously observed that there is no document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism. The context for this often cited phrase is the image of the spoils of war. And Benjamin wrote, according to traditional practice, the spoils are carried along in the procession. They are called cultural treasures, and a historical materialist views them with cautious detachment, for without exception, the cultural treasures he surveys have an origin he cannot contemplate without horror. In my talk today, I would like to return to Benjamin's terms, cultural treasures, civilization, and barbarism, in order to critically interrogate them. However, while Benjamin wanted to explore the possibility of writing a materialist history as a way to restitute the voices of the defeated back into memory and history, I will discuss material struggles for restitution undertaken by victim groups to get back the cultural treasures looted from them. My starting point will be the early Jewish struggle in the wake of World War II to return Nazi-looted books to the Jewish people. This was part of a transnational effort of Jewish intellectuals and organizations who understood the Holocaust not only as an attempt at the physical annihilation of millions of Jews, but also as a plan of cultural genocide. This realization led them to understand the restitution of the books as a first step towards cultural reconstruction. Among these intellectuals were Hannah Arendt and Gershom Scholem, who collaborated under the organization Jewish Cultural Reconstruction, JCR. It was established in New York in 1944 by the Jewish historian Salo Baron. Much of their efforts can be gleaned from their correspondence that was later published as a book. Here, they shared their ideas about restitution and discussed the many practical and legal obstacles they encountered. The correspondence begins, however, with an attempt to save their common friend, Walter Benjamin, who was trapped in Spain while escaping Nazi persecution. Not long after they learn about Benjamin's tragic suicide, do their letters turn to discuss ways to save his literary work and legacy. Behind the technical obstacles that their letters recount, one discovers more fundamental questions about continuity and change, about what can be considered Jewish writings, about translation and new readership. In dealing with the question of how to preserve the legacy of Benjamin, Arendt and Scholem unknowingly prepared themselves for the collective restitution struggle on which they were about to embark after the war over the enormous heirless Jewish heritage left in the wake of the Holocaust, of books, libraries, and archives. In legal discourse, the idea of restitution is primarily tied to a traditional conception of justice as restoration, return, typically of property, between individuals. The underlying assumption here is that injustice disrupts and creates an advantageous state of affairs that can, in principle, be restored, and that this restoration would allow for a return, a reassertion of that past equilibrium. However, this insistence that one can return to things as they actually were in the past was hard to reconcile with the mass murder of 6 million, the destruction of most of the European Jewish communities, and with the refusal of many of the Jewish refugees to return to their previous homes. Faced with the dilemma of restitution, it seems that Benjamin's writing can offer a different way for thinking about the dynamics of preservation and disruption that cultural restitution entails. Benjamin's method of historical inquiry turned away from grand narratives to quotations, and he discovered in the modern use of quotations not the strength to preserve, but to cleanse, to tear out of context, to destroy. Arendt likened Benjamin's approach to the past to that of the pearl diver, whose reaching down to the seabed of the past has a peculiar duality of wanting to preserve and wanting to destroy. Benjamin turned to the art of collecting quotations as a way to address the crisis in tradition, when the authority to pass the full historical narrative on to the next generation disappears. What is left are these fragments, citations from a rich past heritage that lost its force. Yet collecting these fragments can give them new life as tools of expression and critique, by disengaging them from the original context. This practice is of particular importance for Benjamin, who looks for a way to return the voices of the defeated back to history. And since the victors write the history and control the archives, the collection of quotes and fragments offer a new way to tell the history without obeying the dictates of the hegemonic historical narrative. Benjamin's collections of quotes can shed light on another practice, the composition of lists and inventories of lost cultural treasures by victim groups. Unlike a historical narrative, the form of the list is devoid of comprehensiveness and direction. It is often arranged in alphabetical order, geographic or by institutional divisions. It is not chronological and does not have a plot. Importantly, it can contain gaps and lacunas. It is tentative in nature and can be supplemented. Each item, however, was once part of a larger social and cultural context, part of a communal life that no longer exists. By composing lists, the victim group often resorts to archives and catalogs created by the victors themselves, but inverts their purpose. These lists, thus, have a dual face, tearing and reconstructing. The victims try to collect the remnant together and infuse them with new life. In the process of composing these lists, they also transform themselves from passive victims into agents of change. They regain authority by making themselves the experts of their looted cultural objects and the authors of their pasts. The list will be the center of my talk today. I discuss different ways in which victims of collective crimes, genocide, and colonialism begin to compose lists that document their lost cultural treasures. Their restitution struggles revolve around inventory lists of looted cultural treasures. These documents of civilization, which according to Benjamin are at the same time documents of barbarism. What is the alternative vision of restitution advanced by these groups' efforts of mobilization around lists of looted cultural objects? How is it different from the dominant view of restitution that became hegemonic under the 1998 Washington Conference principles? I would like to compare two very different restitution campaigns. The early Jewish campaign after World War II to salvage Nazi-looted books, to contemporary post-colonial campaigns as envisioned in the WWII Restitution Report, dealing with African demands to decolonize European museums. My goal of proposing the comparison is to distill common points of criticism, discursive moves, and reform proposals of existing restitution law advanced by the two struggles. But before we do that, we have to overcome the temptation to compare the current post-colonial campaign to the Holocaust restitution campaign of the 1990s, to restitute Nazi-looted artworks. This campaign adhered to a private property paradigm and focused on rare works of art with huge economic value. It was brought forward by private individuals, mostly family descendants and heirs, and involved complicated provenance research and a case-by-case incremental restitution. In contrast, the campaign for post-colonial restitution, as epitomized by the WWII report, advances a collectivist paradigm. It is brought by African states demanding the return of their cultural heritage from European museums. It envisions a massive return of African collections and articulates its demands in holistic terms, the return of culture. Thus, resisting the narrower focus on rare works of art. Most importantly, although the post-colonial struggle is over objects, its real aim is the rehabilitation of the colonized community by reconnecting it to its lost cultural heritage. In other words, it sees restitution through the prism of memory, as the return of memory, and understands it as part of a healing process of dealing with a traumatic colonial past. I suggest that the early Jewish restitution post-World War II can provide a better model to evaluate the contemporary post-colonial campaign. This comparison can highlight similar characteristics, such as a call to understand the novelty of the crime as one targeting a group by pillaging and destroying its culture, or the resistance to a private property paradigm. In both cases, advocating for collective restitution stems from understanding it within a reparative justice framework, meant to rehabilitate the group by way of reconnecting it to its culture. In both cases, there is a deliberate attempt to avoid a legalist approach in favor of a transitional justice approach focused on the return of memory and history. Advocating for the usefulness of a comparative framework goes against the current. The uniqueness of the Holocaust thesis and the fear that every comparison might end up relativizing the Holocaust have produced great resistance to comparing the Holocaust with other genocides, recently triggering a heated debate. Critics of the uniqueness thesis argue that the hegemony of the Holocaust on international law's conception of genocide occludes the recognition of indigenous or post-colonial forms of suffering and undermines our structural understanding of colonial genocide. Common to these critiques is the understanding that using the Holocaust as a model can be inhibiting, can marginalize certain groups, and distort our understanding of history. In contrast, the framework that I propose here points to the fruitfulness of the comparison between the two restitution campaigns, the early post-Holocaust and the contemporary post-colonial restitution. So let me begin with the early Jewish restitution campaign. The persecution of Jews by the Third Reich involved the methodical confiscation and plunder of Jewish assets throughout Europe, including religious and cultural objects. This was not a byproduct of genocide, but rather an integral part of the systematic efforts by the Nazis to eradicate the Jewish people. During the 1940s and 50s, Jewish organizations attempted to shape the emerging legal concept of genocide to include the attack on economic and cultural life, alongside the physical and biological attack against the Jewish people that resulted in mass murder. Facing the limitations of criminal law to address the crime of genocide, and in particular, the marginalization of the Holocaust in the Nuremberg trial, they took the complementary civil law path. Jewish organizations argued that the law of restitution, and in particular cultural restitution, should be reimagined in order to serve as a counter-response to genocide. Accordingly, they fought for the collective restitution of libraries, archives, and religious objects to the emerging Jewish centers outside of Europe, in the United States and in Israel-Palestine. The early campaign for cultural restitution sought to adjust the law of restitution to the crime of genocide, suffered by the Jews as a collectivity. The Jewish activists argued that the Allies' restitution policy was ill-fitted to address the Jewish reality of a huge category of heirless property that was left at the wake of the Holocaust. Moreover, from a Jewish perspective, the main difficulty emanated from restitution law's fundamental principle of return to the status quo ante, to which the Holocaust posed a major challenge, as only a few diminished and devastated Jewish communities remained in Europe, and international Jewish organizations did not see a future for Jews in Europe. To overcome this difficulty, Jewish jurists set out to modify the law by creating a link between cultural restitution and the crime of genocide. They argued that restitution should not be understood solely through the lens of return of private property to its previous legal owner, but rather as a countermeasure to cultural genocide. Faced with formidable legal difficulties, they aimed to transform three core premises of restitution. First, they wanted to change it from individual restitution of private property to collective restitution to the victim group. and to define what the victim group is. They also wanted to change it from a backward-looking return to the status quo to a forward-looking restitution as a means for cultural rehabilitation and reconstruction. And third, they wanted to change it from a conception of property focused on the economic value of the cultural object to a more holistic understanding of cultural objects as aspects of a Jewish culture that was to be reconstructed and rehabilitated. Books stood at the center of this early Jewish cultural restitution struggle. They carried a dual symbolic meaning as both carrier of memory and transitional objects for the future reconstruction of a group's culture and identity. Let me now move to the contemporary period. In November 2017, French President Emmanuel Macron commissioned two eminent scholars, Felwine Sarr and Bénédicte Savoy, to inquire about African artifacts in French museums and to suggest a legal and political framework for their return. In the 2018 restitution report that the authors wrote, they advocated a new relational ethic between France and Africa as a basis for a policy of restitution. The report explains that colonialism and its accompanying looting denied Africa of its memory. What can a comparison of the current post-colonial campaign to the early, mostly forgotten Jewish restitution campaign teach us? First, under a comparative framework, certain moves, such as the advocacy of collective restitution, can be understood as stemming not from any cultural predilections or legal limitations, such as the absence of private property, but as connected more deeply into the nature of the crime of cultural genocide. If the crime aims to alienate a group from its culture, destroy its identity, and present its culture as inferior, collective restitution is required as a counter-response to the crime. Second, the comparative framework helps identify the central role of law, not only in facilitating such a crime, but also in ensuring the durability of its results. Thus, in both cases, the need arises to devise legal tools that overcome legal obstacles. But the comparison can also help clarify differences, and in particular can illuminate how some of the criticism on the differential treatment of victims of the Holocaust and victims of colonialism is warranted. Even when the campaign to recognize colonialism as a crime is successful, and even in the context of an official report, such as the Sarr-Savoy report, that is meant to facilitate restitution as an act of belated justice, we can still see gaps in the treatment of the victims and the degree of agency accorded to them as trustees of the returned cultural heritage. This is demonstrated in the amount of discretion given to the group and its ability to resist a museum-like approach to cultural return. Here we can notice important differences. To what degree is the group given the freedom to treat the cultural artifacts as a living culture, to be used by the group outside the museum, in religious rituals, in institutions of higher education, and so forth? Would the group be allowed to bury the objects or restrict access of the public to viewing them? The early Jewish campaign was successful in retaining the discretion of in these matters with the Jewish organizations. After a protracted legal and political struggle, the Jewish organizations were able to convince the Americans to change their policy and enact a special law pertaining to Jewish cultural restitution, and to be recognized as trustees of heirless Jewish artifacts. As such, they were able to promote a redistributive program, refusing to treat their books as museum objects. In contrast, although the South-Savoie report recognized the need to re-socialize objects to new social settings, it was still modeled to a large extent on the concept of a museum, and the discretion it envisions is within the confines of professionalism of museum practice. The comparison, therefore, helps highlight the Janus-faced nature of current post-colonial restitution. On the one hand, it marks a rupture with the colonial legacy, seeking to acknowledge responsibility for the crimes of colonialism as crimes against humanity and crimes against culture, and to promote restitution as an act of repair and reparation between the former colonizer and colonized groups. On the other hand, the South-Savoie report is not able to start with a clean slate, as its demands for expertism, its paternalism and rhetoric and metaphors about memoryless Africa are still linked to colonial images and discourses. Let me demonstrate this shortly. The South-Savoie report calls to restitute to Africa its cultural heritage that was looted from it by France. It proposes to restitute back from French museums to source states in Africa. Maps are annexed to the report to serve as an aid to restitution. In one of the maps, African states are colored according to the number of museums in each state, on a scale from deep blue, 30 to 100 museums, to light gray, 1 to 4 museums. It shows a big light stain of gray in the middle of Africa, a void that corresponds with the scarcity of museums. The visual aid of the map has a dual role. On the one hand, it shows the magnitude of the tragedy, when 90% of the cultural treasures of sub-Saharan states reside outside of Africa in Europe, which correlates with the small number of museums in these countries. On the other hand, the map is an aid in determining the criteria for restitution. The report conditions restitution on the ability of the receiving state to professionally tend to the returned objects. The maps in the report reminded me of another map in Joseph Conrad's novel, Heart of Darkness, a colorful map of Africa that draws the protagonist into the dark continent, tempting him to join the colonial forces there and discover its secrets, an ominous sign to what comes next. Although the same image of a map stands at the center of the two texts, they envision the opposite voyage. While Conrad tells of a psychological voyage from civilization to barbarism that entails the release of the European colonialists from moral inhibitions and constraints, the South-Savoie report sees the return of the objects in ethical terms, of return of memory and healing of a collective trauma. The report purports to rectify colonialism's harm in Africa and opts for a therapeutic discourse of post-trauma and memory. It envisions material restitution as a way for African communities to get back their memory and cultural identity. Africa is depicted as an amputee, living a ghost-like existence because its cultural heritage is hidden away in museums across Europe, while its own museums stand empty and its younger generation is ignorant about its cultural heritage. This discourse is reminiscent of the colonial perception of Africa as it is expressed in Heart of Darkness. Africa as being outside of time and memory, of mythological time before the historic time emerged, and Europe as the bearer of history, enlightenment, and culture. The report, although championing a corrective mission, unwittingly recreates this perception of Africa as having no memory and Europe as full of memory. And partly it has this paternalism to it, saying that even if Africans don't want these cultural objects back and prefer other economic compensation, this is just a symptom of their amnesia. So, okay. Is there a way out of this impasse? Comparing the report's approach to the earlier Jewish struggle helps reveal an important difference. Although the two cases demonstrate a shared understanding of the centrality of cultural harm to the group and treating restitution as return of memory, the treatment of the beneficiaries of restitution, acknowledging their voice and agency, is different. So let me return for a minute to the Jewish struggle. Historian Salo Baron considered archives, libraries, and books as particularly important and viewed their salvage as crucial to the return of memory and agency and to the continuity of the Jewish people, saying already in 1946, books have always been the very lifeblood of the people of the book, and he continued to explain why it is important to give his organization, JCR, the trusteeship over them. But note, another thing that I think is crucial here, he explains why restitution, unlike criminal law, is important to the group itself. And he says, this is one area in which Jews speak as Jews, not as displaced persons or refugees. The Jewish element is clearly defined: Jewish cultural treasures, Jewish religious objects, Jewish interests. So the restitution is part of becoming a subject in international law. Baron believed that the restitution of books and other cultural objects would define collective Jewish identity for generations to come. To promote this objective, he, together with a group of Jewish intellectuals, began making lists and documenting the Jewish libraries and archives in the various Jewish communities, demanding their restitution to the Jewish people. Thus, the Jewish restitution case was propelled by a grassroots Jewish activism. They understood Jewish cultural objects as part of a living culture for the use of the various communities, Torah scrolls to synagogues and Judaica books to the Hebrew University or other institutions, instead of treating artifacts as dead objects that belong in a museum. Thus, for example, Yehuda Magnes, the president of the Hebrew University and one of the activists in the restitution campaign, explained that they were not interested in a museum of historical objects, but in Jewish creative scholarship. The Savoir report also shows a proactive attitude towards victims. Here too we find a view of culture as a dynamic, living thing. However, the restitution criteria reflect a professional approach that conditions restitution upon provenance research in European museums and the development of professionalism among African museums and personnel. So let me get back to the list. Let me now turn to an alternative approach to restitution that revolves around lists. And here I would compare something slightly different. On the post-war side, we find the tentative lists project undertaken under the directorship of JCR, headed by Professor Salo Baron. On the post-colonial side, I turn from the Savoir report to a work of the International Inventories Program, known as IIP, that was established in 2018 as an artistic research and curatorial project that investigate Kenyan objects held in cultural institutions outside of Kenya. So this is the Jewish list. 5 tentative lists were published between 1946 and 48 in the periodical Jewish Social Studies that Baron established and edited. The first of those included a list of Jewish cultural treasures in Axis-occupied countries. It documented collections of books, archives, Judaica, Hebraica, and art that existed and were held by Jewish communities and societies and by private collectors prior to the Nazi rule. In his introductory note to the first tentative list, Baron explained that the list was a bottom-up effort. It was composed under extreme conditions that allowed no access to archives of Jewish libraries or community archives. It was therefore prepared by sending out questionnaires to a network of several hundred Jewish emigres and refugees that recollected from memory the cultural objects that existed in their former institutions. The Jewish organizations feared that without objective data, their future claims for reparation and restitution will not be heeded to. Compiling these lists had therefore both practical and symbolic aspects. Practically, they intended that the UN institutions and Jewish leadership would use the lists in order to locate stolen Jewish property and to evaluate legal problems of cultural restitution. Symbolically, the list constituted a roadmap of Jewish culture, serving as a printed, preserved cultural site that contributes to cultural memory and testifies to the Jewish propensity for collecting cultural objects. The list, however, begins with 15 Nazi institutions for the research of the Jewish question, in charge of systematically looting these collections and centers. This beginning points at a close link that these intellectuals made between the crime of genocide and the claim for cultural restitution. The list itself is an alphabetical index of Jewish cultural collections sorted according to the geographic origin of the cultural property, states, and communities. Each entry documents the various books, manuscripts, Judaica, and so forth that could be found in this location. I won't get into it, but going beyond private property, the list includes important Jewish collections or items in non-Jewish institutions that were legally acquired, for example, Judaica, Hebraica in the library in Berlin and in Frankfurt. Including them raises the issue of how to ensure that Jews will have access to their cultural heritage after the Holocaust. Thus, we see that the list envisions a restitution effort that goes beyond property ownership in order to reconstruct a devastated cultural group. Turning now to the post-colonial. When we turn to the IIP, the International Inventory Program, we see another transnational mobilization around a list, this time between activists in Kenya and Germany. The IIP that was established in 2018 as an artistic research and curatorial project brings together a constellation of cultural entities, museums in Kenya and in Germany. But unlike the earlier Jewish restitution campaign, contemporary African activists understand restitution not as severing connections, but as dependent on creating a long-term transnational collaboration. By the way, also Hannah Arendt, who was the director of research, tried to have this collaboration early on with German institutions, but she failed. The creation of the database necessitated the collaboration of European museums to share their inventories with the collective, as well as to design public events like exhibitions and discussions to express African voices that were not heard enough or forgotten. Here too we notice a combination of practical and symbolic goals. Practically, the IIP aims to generate a comprehensive inventory of Kenyan artifacts and cultural objects held in public institutions abroad, and to build exchange relations and strengthen collaboration between the museum in Kenya and key cultural institutions in Germany that hold Kenyan objects as part of their collections. Symbolically, the project aims to serve as a catalyst for the activation of true and honest knowledge about these objects and their real-life contexts. The main facet of the project is the inventory, a database listing of 32,501 objects from 30 institutions in 7 countries. Since 2019, they have been contacting museums around the world to share their data of the Kenyan cultural heritage in their collections to build a database of Kenyan objects held in the global north. The database is accessible online and is accompanied by a map, texts, visualizations, recorded conversations, and artworks. A major artistic production that accompanied the database is the Invisible Inventories exhibition that you see here. Contemporary artwork meant to engage the wider public in an open conversation about the presence of these objects in Germany, their provenance, and the results of the object's absence in Kenya. For both groups, the list became a nucleus for bottom-up mobilization that challenges a conservative understanding of restitution advanced by lawyers and museum gatekeepers. The list that the group composed served multiple aims: as testimony to silenced histories of cultural erasure, as evidence of the huge extent of the looting of cultural objects, as the basis for restitution claims, and as a first step towards cultural reconstruction and renewal. The creation of the list became an act of regaining agency by the victim groups. Instead of a past-oriented approach to restitution, the list served as a way to imagine a new future. Like Benjamin's Pearl Diver, the two groups attempt to save objects from the sea of amnesia to allow for a new beginning. This is to allow for a new beginning. Their restitution efforts echo, therefore, Benjamin's prophetic words, as he wrote, "Only because they did not let themselves be fooled by the professional preservers all around them did they finally discover that the destructive power of quotations was the only one which still contains the hope that something from this period will survive, for no other reason than that it was torn out of it." Thank you. I think we need to, yeah. Should we sit here?
But yeah, come up if you want. Or we would like to hear some questions. Go ahead, I'll stand and. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Very, very interesting. Anyone like to start with a question? Gosh, let's start with Chagai. Take the microphone for, okay.
Okay, can you hear me? Does it work? Yeah. Thank you for the fascinating talk. My question is maybe a bit preliminary to the talk, but I mean, so I'm wondering kind of what's the status of objects in a culture? And it strikes me, and I'm asking out of ignorance, so it's not, I'm not trying to state anything, but it's a genuine question. So you mentioned kind of in passing that in Judaism, objects have a lot of, books and objects have a lot of meaning as part of the culture. And maybe to some extent it's not the same in other cultures, but that doesn't mean that, you know, so I'm kind of, the question is what is left out when we focused on objects? What are others things in a culture that might be maybe were unable to restitute, or maybe we could using other methods, not lists and physical restitution. If you think about Native Americans, a lot of what European kind of conquest of America wasn't so much about taking objects, was more about destructing a culture, a way of living, and maybe Africa is somewhere in the middle between that. So it's not really to the point of your, but it's kind of.
Please.
Thank you. This is a wonderful question. So let me just give a few directions to an answer. So first objective of my talk was to differentiate between different kind of objects. And I was talking about cultural genocide and showing how cultural genocide translated since the 1990s, especially with the Washington Conference principles, into works of art that usually are very valuable economically, millions of dollars and so forth. So one of my objectives was to remind us that these are not the only objects that we should look at, and the decision of the early Jewish campaign to focus on books was, first of all, these books were found and heirless and so forth, but the idea was that books are of importance to the victim group and not necessarily to others, and there will not be this struggle over the economic value, and they are transitional, unlike cemeteries, unlike houses and so forth. So as transitional objects, they envision the books as transitioning the culture together with them to the new cultural centers. So I'm saying this to just tell you that objects can be of importance. But partly what I wanted to say is that objects can be, if you look, and I didn't get into it, at the lists of the Kenyan database, you see that a lot of the objects are everyday objects of people working in the fields and so forth, but the European took them and put them in museums. And a lot of them, they are not exhibited at all, but they cannot return them because a precondition is to have them in a museum, right? And not, so you see that there is this understanding that they wanted part of the objects, and I didn't have the time to show you. I wanted to end this talk with one object. It looked like it's long
sword, a sword,
or a long, I don't know, something like this. And two activists, one Kenyan and one German, got to an exhibition in Germany and saw that all the objects, the African objects, are there. And there is no provenance. The list is also very interesting because you see that they didn't document where from, how. So they asked for one object to return back to Africa. And the museum agreed. But then the insurance was so huge, they couldn't bring this object back to Africa. So they decided to take a photo, a three-dimensional photo, on an iPad, and they took it to Africa, to the center of the town, Nairobi, I think it was, and they built like a museum counter, right? And they invite people to look at this iPad. And there begins a conversation among the young people, and you see how they don't know what this object is about. And the provenance they ask for is not who owned it before, but what was the purpose of this object? And nobody knows. So they continue to the village and go on, and this is a whole film about it. And finally, they get to the language changes, by the way. It begins with English, and then it turns to the languages of the tribes. And only a very old leader in a closed, they didn't allow them to enter with a camera, because it's holy. you can only hear. So what you find out finally, that this object that looks like a stick, right? It turned out that for young boys in this tribe, when they get around, puberty around 12 or so, they have to throw this object.
Spear.
Over a huge tree that is still there, right? If they manage to get the object over the tree, they are
Man. You are now a man.
And they can be circumcised and so forth. If not, you stay, another year. But it was, you see that the object is about memory of a tradition that was completely erased. So I think that the objects are interesting not just for their worth and not just for their objectivity, but for the way of life, traditions, and the connection between the old generation, the new one. So, and this is part of the group. The film was made as part of their efforts.
But also in this story, the virtual medium was more effective in provoking a conversation than the object.
Yeah.
Because now we're conditioned, young people go to a museum and they see a spear. It's not going to stir anything in them.
Yes.
But a picture of a sphere on an iPad,
And technology also...
a virtual spear, is going to start a conversation.
Yes, and it is technology.
Because it's the
allows us to
absence.
share.
It's the presence and the absence of the spear.
Yeah.
And it's about memory.
And that's why it's so
That's
wonderful.
very cool.
Yes, very cool.
Fascinating. And Nachum, you had your hand.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much. It was fascinating, really, really fascinating topic and really, really important. I have 3 questions. First, there are new museums, old museum, Jewish museum all over Europe now, like in Warsaw. Do you know if they asking for the restitution of Polish Jewish property or books from Yivo and other places back to Europe? Second, I was thinking that it might be that genocide and decolonization or colonization are not the same. They're not the same concept. You cannot de-genocide, and in decolonization you can reclaim your own property, even though during colonization we know that people are killed or are displaced and so forth, but still it's not the same. So I don't know, so I think it's a conceptual parallel here. And last, of course, is the elephant in the room, and the question is, are you going to follow up this discussion into close to home, to the Palestinian property, and also our Jewish Arab property in Arab countries as well?
Great. Wow. 3 very easy questions. Let me begin with the second one because it's the conceptual one. You say, if I understood you correctly, you can decolonize, but you cannot de-genocide. And I want to disagree in the sense that if you go back to Lemkin's and to other Jewish thinkers that, but mostly for Lemkin, when he coined the term of Lemkin genocide, he said, well, why do we need a new term? We have murder. We have mass murder. What's the meaning of genocide? What is it that we are looking for? And he said, well, the difference is that here is an attempt to murder a group. How do you murder a group, right? A group, a collectivity, is not something that we see, right? And he said, you murder them, you destroy a group through its identity. And the identity can be its culture, its books, its history, everything, right? So in the center of his understanding of genocide stands cultural genocide that was, of course, because of colonial fears, was put outside of the genocide convention that was put into practice in international law. So in this sense, you can try to de-genocide like decolonial. They come together. Of course, there is difference between physical and biological genocide. But what I want to say is that I think you hit a very important point that, and part of my work on Salo Baron and the Eichmann trial is the attempt to move cultural genocide into a criminal setting is very difficult because a lot of time a group that was under attempt of genocide finds way to renew itself. So the question is there a genocide or is there no? And Servatius, the defense lawyer for Eichmann, said, well, we certainly tried to destroy you, but look, you created a new state. We are to be congratulated on our genocidal attempt because a new entity was created. Of course, it's very cynical, but it shows us the difficulty of how do we understand genocide. Restitution in civil litigation is easier because they try to show that restitution is a counter response to genocide. Give us restitution. The problem here is that in the civil track, you follow the property ownership. And they didn't have the owners because it's heirless. So they had a different problem. That's why I said they needed the collective. Now, I won't run away from your two other questions, which are very political, of course. The first one, I followed one restitution attempt about the archive of Vienna that took place in Israeli courts because this Jewish community reconstructed itself.
Just wanted to say that your lecture was also political, so.
My lecture?
Yeah.
Of course, everything is political. I'm not, for me, political is good. But just to say, it's not, I'm saying that, so there was a question whether Israel will return it to Vienna once the Jewish community restored itself, and I thought it should, and the court didn't agree with me. So you are right that there is these struggles going on. Now about the Palestinian issue, I think it's immensely important to look into the question of the archives and books that Palestinian books that are there in the National Library and in other research institutions. And a lot of time the problem is that cultural genocide or even this looting, crimes against culture is not recognized in international law as such because it is under war crimes and so forth. So still this the request of groups to return to them their books not as property but as way to rebuild their culture is not recognized, and I think it's extremely important. And I know of some groups that do the same with Palestine. They begin with the lists of their books and try to make it public. So yes, I agree with you that it's very important. I think that that's what you thought.
Interesting.
Kind of go back to the first question. One of the things that struck me in talking about books, restitution of books to the Jewish community, the Kenyan groups from which objects were taken prior to colonialism didn't have a written language except on the East Coast and Swahili Coast. And so I actually think there's an interesting equivalence there because in oral societies, the objects often were very important for the stories that they could tell that were passed down from generation to generation. And so I think there's an interesting parallel there, actually. And I assume that's what you were trying to say, but perhaps not. And if you weren't, I think it's something you could raise more clearly because I do think it's an interesting connection.
Can you repeat about the oral history? I didn't get it.
Well, for the Kikuyu people, for example, they did not have a written language at the time, and so objects were often useful as you are passing your stories down from generation to generation.
Exactly. I think that this is right. So this is what the film was trying to do, to return to oral history. But I think that to oral traditions. But I think you also touch about the question of documents, provenance research, archives, and oral history, testimonies, right? And there is a hierarchy between them. And that's why I stressed that the Jewish struggle began with oral history because they had to reconstruct from memory the catalogs and the lists that were there. And in order to, while Polish intellectuals, for example, did have access to their catalogs and they could rely on them. So I think that one of the contribution of Holocaust studies was to raise the idea of testimony and oral history to equal footing with the documents that are a lot of time prepared by perpetrators. But I think that you raise a more delicate issue about objects and memory for non-literate groups, and I cannot agree more. So, yes.
Can I just add one other aside, which is I did some work and training for the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, and they took a very legalistic approach based on mostly European law that was brought in. And they actually weren't interested in documents at all and only wanted oral history. They wanted testimonies. And I was working with an historian. We'd gathered quite a few documents about the genocide and tried to get them to them. And it was a struggle to get them to actually pay attention to written documents.
Oh, interesting. Wow. Okay. So the conundrum has changed. Okay.
Lori.
That was so richly suggestive. My mind is spinning. And I don't have a clearly formulated question, but I think I'm reaching for something related to this last moment around the violent disruptions of history and what that, the needs that those then create in our efforts to restitute. Versus the natural evolutions of cultural change. And I think it's what I'm struggling with is nostalgia, something affective in our relationship to the past, the kitchification of the past. You know, how I was so disturbed by visiting places in Poland where Jews had been erased, but Jewish nonsense, tchotchkes, were ubiquitous.
Yes.
And it made me see instantly that this is what we did with indigenous populations in America. We, created totem poles at gas stations. And that's one kind of,
Yes.
cultural freezing that's both sentimental and in some ways ugly. And then I was thinking of the contemporary Middle East too, and I think that the response to the Palestinian question here was a little bit evasive in that we're talking about both property and culture, but also the Ethiopian populations and what happened to their all the assimilated populations, the Yemenite, and how some of this is the natural evolution. There's historical evolution and cultural mingling and intercultural penetrations, and then there are violent disruptions. And I feel from your talk that you're comparing two violent disruptions that are different, and somehow segregating that from other kinds of historical cultural evolution. So
Okay.
and it's not, I don't know what to do with that.
No, I it's very it's very helpful. I think that that you point exactly to why I chose to begin and end my talk with Benjamin, because of his dialectic between conserving and destroying. And I think that something in me is very much against the conservation, what you call the nostalgic, the kitschy, return to something that is not there and making it into a museum-like. So I think that the two struggles that I chose was precisely anti this nostalgia, because also with the Jewish struggle, there was a suggestion, let's take all these books and build a library in Copenhagen and everybody could see. And they said, no, we need these books. We need to learn them. We need to pray with them. We need to different things with them. Don't make them into this kind of frozen museum. But you ask also, and this is the difficulty, what is the relation between evolution and disruption like this and change? And I think that what is fascinating is that they rely on the language of restitution, to restitute, to go back, right? But they envision the future. They want to take restitution in order to build a new collectivity, the Jewish people, in new practices, of secular and learning, but to use this language of restitution as if it's authenticized what they are doing as continuity, but it is never continuity. So I think this is why it's interesting to see how the law can allow you for different kinds of restitution, but the choice of a neoliberal capitalist restitution that we are now having of one by one items and not return of a culture is just one. And we should look at other options and a lot of time engage the grassroots efforts of the groups to see what do they want to do with it and how do they approach this disruption that was there. But maybe I didn't answer you fully, but it's a train of thought that I am very much interested in. So.
Nancy and then Steve.
That was absolutely fascinating.
Thank you.
It's a really fascinating talk.
Speak a little louder. Just
I
speak a little louder.
It's not on.
No, just speak a little louder.
Now it's on, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Anyway, that was a fascinating talk. It just has made me think of a lot of things, from Cesare Lombroso's material positivism of the 19th century and how he conceived Judaism, to thinking about anti-Judaism versus anti-Semitism, to thinking about the ritual objects that the Nazis were trying to destroy. But it makes me wonder also about the relationship of culture and identity to those objects. It seems like it needs to be very fluid, that it's not easy to pin down, that it is going to move from generation to generation. And also to say, just in response to Lori, that the kitschification is not restitution, in my view, it's appropriation, right? When you see the non-Jewish klezmer musicians in Warsaw, for example, you see the little rabbi toys and the kinds of stuff they have there. I mean, that's not restitution. That's actually offensive appropriation, in my view. It's making me think about a lot of things, so I thank you for that. I'm not sure there was a question there.
And Steve, can you wait for the microphone?
Thank you. It was a very interesting talk that made me think about a lot of things. And I would just ask a question. First, the definition of, you asked before about Lemkin, why do you need a new term? And the crucial word that you left out was intention. That is to say, genocide means the intentional destruction of a group in whole or in part. Now, the definition itself is problematic because how big a part is a part that constitutes, right? So, for example, as you know, the ICC in Srebrenica made up its own definition to define that as genocide in a very strange decision. But I would say to you that colonialism is radically different than what happened in Europe. When you colonize, you want to keep the local population alive. And when you steal their treasures, it's because in a way you value them. So if you bring them to Paris and show them in the museum at the Louvre or in the British Museum, you're showing works of great historical value. People like to look at them. They're beautiful, they're living, they're, all kinds of cultural values. The Nazis didn't attribute any of those values to Jewish things. They collected all of the Jewish things because they were going to build a museum to a destroyed people, and they're going to put it in Prague. And all of these objects were to show how degenerate the Jewish people were. So I'm not sure if the comparison of the stealing of treasures from African countries under the rubric of colonialism and stealing the treasures of an entirely dead Judenrein community in Europe are really comparable. And I think one needs to explore more fully what these two collections represent. Now, Baron, I'm happy to say you mentioned two of my great teachers, Baron and Sholem, but the fact is, Baron was trying to breed into this a whole historical understanding that went along with the post-restitution, which wasn't in the colonial discussion, but it was a very interesting talk. Tadarba.
Thank you. I think that I'm glad that you raised the question of comparisons. And I think that, of course, intention is important. But when you look, what I focused on is cultural genocide. And there is the same intention. The intention is to inferiorize this culture, to alienate the people from their culture. Sometimes you also murder them, like with the Jews, but it is not necessarily so in order to destroy a group. Now, I want to add, and to disagree a little bit with some of the assumptions you said. One is that the group that really tried to prosecute cultural genocide were the Polish trials post-World War II, that they tried to show how the German project with Poland was colonizing the Polish people, killing their intelligentsia, and taking all their museums and the books and so forth, in order also to create, to differentiate, to say you are a people that only have folklore, and we are going to have this. So this was part of the, and this was also happened with the Jews. You have a forced laborer in Vilna of Jewish intellectuals who had to choose the best of the Jewish books, like Abraham Sutzkever's and others, and they are transferred to research institutions in order to rewrite the history and to present it as Judaism as something inferior and so forth. Now, what you see with Africa is very similar. A lot of time, you don't see value of their objects. You are creating an anthropological museum. You are creating hierarchies between different groups. You are putting their objects not in fine art museums, but in museums to show the evolution of humanity. So this is all part of the Sarr-Savoy report, who explains the role of the academia, how anthropology is connected to this looting, and how these, even when it is in a museum, it's not out of appreciation. It's out of decontextualizing and putting it under a European gaze. So I think the difference is not so big if you focus on cultural genocide and on cultural restitution struggles. Now, about Baron, I have a whole lecture. I almost gave it here, but I decided to give it in the Cut Center, so that's why you didn't get it. Thank you.
He was a great man.
I agree.
I think we're going to say thank you, and thanks to all of you for coming. Thank you so much for this amazing talk. It was a great seminar. Yes, it was.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, for coming.
Thank you, Pina, for this. Okay. We move into Hebrew.
very faint in terms.